All right, let's get started. A warm welcome to this webinar on adapting social protection systems to context of forced displacement. My name is Maren. I'm a social protection advisor with GIZ, and I'm excited to facilitate the webinar today. Let me say a few words on the framing on this webinar on the co-learning space it aims to provide. Today is the 7th session of the Aspects Practice Exchange on Adaptive Social Protection. Each webinar within this series is dedicated to providing an informal room for practitioners and experts, policymakers who can share and exchange perspectives on adaptive social protection. And the series is a joint effort of the GIZ Global Program Social Protection Innovation and Learning on behalf of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the BMZ, in close cooperation with socialprotection.org. Discussions in the webinar are centered around the 4 building blocks of adaptive social protection, which we consider being an institutional arrangements, programs, data and information, as well as finances. The discussion today on inclusive social protection systems is linked to the building block on programs, which then includes dimensions such as the convergence of long and short-term programs, scalability and search functions, including to cover populations at risk, developing program guidance, accountability to affected population, and many more. Now to today's webinar, frequent and sustained conflict, violence, human rights violations, persecution, climate change, natural hazards have pushed forced displacement to record levels in the last decade, and there is need for long-term solutions. I'm not telling anyone anything new, I assume. Our very distinguished panelists of today will discuss with you about how national social protection systems can be part of this solution and can be designed in a more adaptive and flexible way so that these population groups can be integrated. Let me introduce you the panelists for today. We have Karin Seyfert with us. Karin is the country director of Oxford Policy Management in Europe. She has 12 years experience focused on forced migration and the nexus between development and humanitarian support, and she will kick us off today with a framing presentation. We also have Andrew Mitchell, Senior Social Protection Officer with the UNHCR and leading its global work on aligning and transitioning humanitarian assistance to government social protection programs, particularly for populations in protracted situations. And Andrew today will provide us insight to the different stages and timelines of the pathway towards inclusive social protection systems. And finally, we're very glad to have Tanya Nino on board, Social Protection Officer with the World Food Programme in Colombia. And Tanya will close the round of inputs today with a presentation of WFP and the government of Colombia's social protection work with Venezuelans displaced in Colombia. So before starting, please be reminded to put your questions in the Q&A box. You can either address a specific speaker or post general questions. You can also upvote questions of your colleagues, which will then let me know which questions are of more interest, and I can prioritize accordingly. So without further ado, Karin, over to you for putting a framework to the discussion of today. Karin, you're muted.
Apologies, screen sharing and unmuting is still a bit beyond my Zoom capabilities. Thank you everybody for joining. Can you see my screen? So I assume that you can. Thank you so much.
See your notes, not the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll start again. Apologies for that. How about now?
There you go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maren. Apologies, there's always one person who has a few hiccups. Thanks everybody for joining this presentation. So as Maren said, my presentation will mostly be setting the scene, while Andrew and Tanya will be talking, I think, with more specifics. Some of what I will say will be a bit repetitious for both, or for some attendees, but I thought I'll just go over some basic definitions. So I'll start with what is social protection, and followed by why adaptive social protection. So what's the whole rationale behind that? And then I'll very quickly talk about definitions of forced displacement, or who we consider the forcibly displaced. And I'll close by talking about this intersection about what are social protection entitlements for forcibly displaced, and also commenting a little bit on practice. So social protection, the definition by the SPIAC-B sees it as the set of policies and programs aimed at preventing and protecting all people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. And that includes life cycle considerations and also an emphasis on particularly vulnerable groups. And social protection is composed of, or there are various approaches or definitions, but I will go over 4 building blocks that are quite commonly accepted. The first would be social assistance. That includes cash transfers, vouchers, in kind, including school feeding, but also public works programs and subsidies and fee waivers, like, for instance, fuel subsidies. And the main intention behind social assistance is to reduce poverty and inequality. A second building block is social insurance. This would be contributory, meaning people, usually in formal employment, pay into unemployment insurance that insures them against disability or ill health, old age, and that means they get payouts for parental leave. And the main aim behind social insurance would be protecting people and ensuring adequate living standards in the face of shocks and life changes. The third block are labor market interventions. Those would be training and reskilling, particularly relevant with sort of current discussions around sort of a just transition and sort of transitioning economies from requiring one skill set to another. That will be done through labor market interventions, but it also includes employability like CV trainings, digital literacy, job matching, job placements, wage subsidies, all these activities. And the main aim of them is to improve opportunities through enabling better employment, work, and livelihoods. And then the last block, and this is the one that is not always included in social protection, but I think it is, especially in the context of refugees or the forcibly displaced, really important, and that's social services. So that includes all kinds of social work, care for children, the elderly, persons with disability. It also includes psychosocial care. And the main objective of that is protecting and supporting the most vulnerable, removing barriers and helping to overcome trauma. So this is a very quick whistle stop over what we mean when we say social protection, and just to give you an overview that it's not just sort of cash transfers, but there's a whole gamut of programs and approaches. Now, why adaptive social protection? So the idea behind adaptive social protection is to use the experience and the capacity and also the delivery mechanisms of existing social protection systems in a crisis response. So shocks that affect a sizable proportion of the population simultaneously, called covariate shocks, like floods or droughts, can have long-term adverse life consequences. If you follow sort of the light blue line on the slides, you'll see the long-term lower level of well-being. And enrollment into a social protection system, like the dotted gray line on the slides, can help to keep these negative impacts to people at a minimum, and then regain as much as possible the pre-shock development path. So this is the idealized rationale why adaptive social protection. I will also very quickly, again, whistle-stop tour approach, go through different ways of systems to respond. This is based on O'Brien's 2018, O'Brien et al.'s 2018 paper. I'm not going to touch on the 4 building blocks that Maren mentioned in the beginning. I think Andrew and Tanya will talk about those more. So how can systems adapt? So one of them would be just design tweaks. So making small and proactive adjustments to the design of routine social protection programs. For instance, including long-term resilience to shocks or inclusion of refugees as an explicit aim of social protection programming. It also could mean allowing people to receive cash transfers over the counter instead of a bank card, or to include vulnerability to a shock as an explicit target criterion. Another one would be piggybacking. So that means having a program that responds to a crisis, but piggyback on an existing national system or even existing system run by a non-government actor, like a database or an existing payment mechanism or existing registration infrastructure. That would be piggybacking on existing infrastructure. A third one would be to increase the value or duration or the benefit of existing beneficiaries. So increasing the value, but also giving additional benefits, like, for example, a bus pass or a school meal. And a fourth would be increasing the number of recipients. And so temporarily including new beneficiaries from communities that are affected by the shock. And sort of the last two ones, vertical and horizontal expansions, are ones that we've seen, for instance, really commonly to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. They'll be one of the first responses that we've seen, or one of the very early ones. Now, let me move on to definitions of forced displacement. So first of all, there has to be, the displacement is forced, meaning it is not voluntary, and then there's a common definition or a distinction between, do people cross the border, do they not cross the border? If they're forcibly displaced people who do not cross the border, that would be called internally displaced persons. So they're forced to leave their home to avoid the effects of armed conflict or situations of violence, violations of human rights, or natural human-made disasters. If they have crossed the border, where there's refugees, so forcibly displaced across the border with recognized protection status, and that is quite important. That also includes asylum seekers. So they have made a claim, but this claim has not yet been determined, meaning their status is still unclear. And then we have Venezuelans displaced abroad, and Tanya will talk more about that. And Venezuelans are those who are likely to need international protection under the Cartagena Declaration, but who have not applied for asylum. Now, why are these differences important, or why did I just go through this definition of sort of status, or definitions of who has what kind of papers, basically? And that is because status is important about who is responsible for care. And there, again, this border crossing element is important. So forcibly displaced across border are under international protection. So that means the organizations responsible for providing care would mostly be the international community, unless in many OECD countries that duty or the idea of international protection still persists, but the provider of services would be governance. But for internally displaced, they are still under national protection. That means the duty of care is theoretically still with governments, but very often these IDPs cannot avail themselves of social protection or of their sort of the rights that they would have as a citizen. And that's for various reasons. So for example, they might not be capable. So infrastructure might be disrupted, or there might be reduced capacities of the systems. Or there's also systems that might not allow portability across regions, for instance, as we have in Ethiopia. Or there might also be a context where the internally displaced or the government is not willing to assist them. And that is because often internal displacement has a political dimension, for instance, the Rohingya in Myanmar, and that might result to IDPs not having access to social protection. And in these cases, very often international agencies also step in. Just sort of in terms of talking about the international governance of sort of social protection and forced displacement, SDG 1.3.1 says everyone should be entitled to social protection. So there is a global consensus to everybody having the right to it, but who's the duty bearer? So whose duty is it to provide it? And again, quite quickly, I will go through a few international conventions that lay out these rights. And before closing and discussing how does it actually work in practice. So the most commonly cited is the 51 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And that declares that access to public relief, labor protection legislation, and social security should be provided to those with refugee status alongside citizens. However, this convention, many countries object to this convention, even those that are signatory to this convention, have since created sort of temporary or subsidiary statuses that are less than refugee status. And that is a way to reduce entitlements. So if the convention says refugees should be provided access on the same lines as citizens, if a forcibly displaced person has subsidiary status, for example, there's a way to reduce these entitlements, so giving them a lower level of wealth of transfers, also restricted by time, etc. So that is a way for countries to, many countries to reduce entitlements. And in many contexts, the provision of sort of these benefits, as in public relief, is led by international actors, and often also in parallel to national systems, although I'm sure, as Andrew and Tanya will talk about, that is changing and there's sort of increasing interaction. Then sort of the next important declaration I want to talk about is the 2016 New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. That calls for refugees to be able to access national social assistance programs and also for host communities to be included in programs for refugees. This is the first. And that led to the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which provides much of the sort of background for a lot of the recent operational innovations that we have seen in providing cash transfers to refugees, as well as the Global Compact for Refugees. And so the first two ones are more sort of declarations. The third point, the 2018 World Bank funding window, or called IDA 18, is basically putting, if you want to say, money where the mouth is. So this is the funding window under which middle-income countries hosting refugees are also eligible for concessionary funding. And this funding cannot just be used to support refugees, but also to support commitments by host governments to address social and economic dimensions of the refugee situations, including host communities. So this is the theory. Before handing over to Andrew and Tanya, I want to very, very quickly just go back to these 4 building blocks that we talked about in the beginning and just outline some key barriers that exist for refugees to access social protection. And I'm specifically here talking about refugees because the situation for IDPs, as I alluded to before earlier, is a little bit more complex, since theoretically they have someone, or they're still under government protection, and often the reasons why IDPs don't have access to social protection are quite different and related to either sort of disrupted infrastructure or to sort of political dimensions of not the system, or the government not even wanting to provide support. So moving back to sort of the 4 building blocks. So for social assistance, i.e. cash transfers, welfare payments, a key barrier for refugees accessing state systems is our nationality requirements and residence requirements. So, and as I mentioned before, so the introduction of a subsidiary status or a lower status is often used as a way to lower entitlements. And on top of that, there are also operational barriers related around the systems that exist cater to citizens, so they have requirements on documentation, language, assumptions of awareness how a system works that refugees won't have. And I trust that Andrew and Tanya will talk about this in more detail. There's also a really nice paper from ODI about to come out that talks about the experience of refugees that has a lot of detail on these operational barriers. Then for social insurance, the key barrier here is the right to work and formal employment. So many refugees are not allowed to work in host countries. And then even if they're allowed to work, they are often in informal employment. And this is sort of in many countries where informal employment is the majority, or most workers are in informal employment, then refugees would also be in informal employment. So that's not necessarily just a refugee-specific barrier, but a general one, access to social insurance requiring formal employment. Another one is the lack of portability. So meaning that if you're a refugee, you're formally employed in one country, but you want to retire in another one, that doesn't mean you can take your benefits with you. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, for social assistance, operational barriers, documentation, language, etc., also a big obstacle. Now, for labor market interventions, here the key barrier is the low capacity of these sort of services in host countries. So often hosting countries are unable to provide labor market interventions to the required volume, even to their citizens. And sort of this is something I think where there's some change, but the ability to deliver labor market interventions at scale is something that even for citizens is quite limited. There are some small scale projects by non-governmental international agencies, sort of employability programs, you know, sort of opening small businesses, but a lot of them are very small scale, meaning the hundreds of beneficiaries rather than the tens of thousands that will be required. And then the last one for social care, again, here the key barrier to access is also low capacity of many host countries. And not just capacity in the sense of, yes, there aren't enough women's shelters. Yes, there aren't enough child-friendly spaces. Yes, there aren't enough psychosocial care facilities, but also a lack of specific technical expertise. So how to deal with people who come from a background of forced displacement. And I think this is an area where humanitarian agencies and non-governmental agencies with this specific expertise have a really strong role in sort of plugging that gap in national systems. And we've seen that happening, for example, in Turkey, but we also see this in OECD countries like, for instance, Germany, the UK, where non-governmental agencies do a lot of the sort of last mile hand-holding support to connect refugees to services, but also provide a lot of the social care services, basically. That's it for me for now. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, happy to answer any questions. And over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Karin. Just quickly before Andrew comes in, super interesting. And I think it's very helpful for everyone, basically, to be reminded so structured and clearly what and who are we talking about, who's in charge to provide assistance, why, and based on what convention is that the case, how can inclusiveness look like, and what barriers oppose inclusion efforts. So many thanks for that. To the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I saw it just started. Thank you for that. And to Andrew, over to you. Let's build on Karin's presentation to refine the framing a little bit and deep dive maybe into the differences between altering a system versus bouncing back from a shock, or between long-term inclusion agenda and systems level versus short-term protection of gains. So Andrew, over to you.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. So today I'll be talking about the inclusion of refugees in social protection systems and some of the emerging lessons coming from our country offices. And I really want to start by clarifying how we view the difference between adapting a system leading to long-term changes and how it functions. And for us, this is the long-term inclusion agenda for forcibly displaced persons, versus an adaptive mechanism or a shock responsive capacity that's applied as a short-term and time-bound capacity. And this is made specifically to counter the impacts of widespread shocks. It's important to differentiate this because it involves different functions, actions, and funding mechanisms to put these in place. And as I go and visit our field teams, but also other agencies, I think there's still some confusion about these two ways of dealing with the social protection system that we can talk about, you know, how people see this on the ground as well. So firstly, I want to focus on adapting a social protection system. We're doing this to meet the very specific vulnerabilities, but also to harness the capacities of refugees who are non-nationals and who often have a different access to and enjoyment of rights than citizens. So when we're at the country office level and when we're formulating a strategy planning and the priority actions, we look at adapting systems taking into account 3 issues. So we can do the first click, Karin. So firstly, what we're looking at, another click, is the displacement cycle. If you click again. And so we're trying to look at what are the long-term goals we're trying to achieve. Where is the context now? Where is it evolving, you know, in the next 3 to 5 years? And as you see, going from the H in a clockwise sense, Unfortunately, many contexts are pumping out wave after wave of displacement. So we go from the emergency context over towards protracted displacement, where the bulk of refugees are now located. Before the Ukraine crisis is more than 3/4 of the global caseload. And then on to a durable solution. Unfortunately, it's less than 1% of refugees achieving a durable solution. And unfortunately, many contexts develop fragility again, and we go around the cycle again. So in terms of adapting what we're trying to do, we're really looking at long-term goals according to focusing on different parts of the system, according to where we are in those 4 quadrants. And concretely, this is what it means to work around across the HDP nexus. I'm not going to talk about that today because I want to go into a little bit more detail. The second thing that we do, and can you click again and again? Can you click another? Yeah, is that the second thing where we're trying to sort out our intermediate goals is we really focus on transitioning across that emergency sector over towards protracted displacement and hopefully onto a durable solution. Let's say that the key pragmatic way of trying to manage protracted displacement is increasingly trying to work on different alignment of our systems and inclusion in government systems. And this happens along a pathway. Progress along that pathway is regulated by a set of enabling factors, which I'm not going to go into today. But this is what we concretely talk about when we're aligning our assistance stepwise towards inclusion. And many cash officers are familiar with this, where we have parallel operations. We try to do some type of alignment. We try to work then on an area-based approach with a common project that tries to work on both host and refugee populations. And then eventually, when we're able to secure full rights and the access to the rights, we can include refugees into the social protection systems. And we would like to in the future, and we'll get onto this, about trying to have an adaptive or shock responsive capacity that can allow that system as part of contingency planning to take on new arrivals. So these are the type of intermediate goals, and we try to see how far we can push along that pathway and how we can unlock the enabling factors. The third thing that we take into account, and can you click click again, is, and this is what I want to focus on today, around a project cycle with short-term goals. What do we mean by adapting the social protection system for forcibly displaced persons along the social protection delivery chain? So this is a diagram of the standard World Bank model of a social protection delivery chain. And what I want to go through is some of the key practices at each step of the delivery chain in terms of what adapting a system means. Just the last click on this slide. The other thing I want to emphasize, and again, I won't go into it today, but inclusion in social protection systems, and I would venture other key social systems, is underpinned by building self-reliance and economic inclusion. And this is an intrinsic part of the business case to governments. They want to understand at what stage will refugees start to pay into systems, either directly or indirectly. And one of the critical factors that we need to get to grips with is, given that most refugees are in the informal labour sector, and they will stay there, there's just not the absorbance capacity to transform informal labour markets into formal labour markets. What can we do about graduating from informal to formal labour markets, and how can we connect both sets of workers to formal social protection benefits? This is a key area for the future, but I just wanted to put it in there that adapting a social protection system doesn't happen in space. It needs to be linked with other, let's say, key enabling factors. On to the next slide, please. So what we found is that in our different operations, what we're trying to do and stepping up is to add a technical assistance layer on top of the usual protection products and services that we offer the government and other actors. And I want to emphasize that we are trying to offer technical assistance on top of, but intrinsically informed by detailed de jure access to rights on paper versus de facto access to rights actually at the local level by that type of detailed analysis, by intention surveys to understand where people are going to go, and displacement modelling. And this is a key factor, for example, in the evolving Ukraine crisis. And so what we like to do is at a project cycle to offer very specific technical assistance around the government, or in this case, we've been assisting different World Bank projects under the IDA 18 and IDA 19 refugee sub-window. And we're talking about rolling out 6 types of, let's say, generic services. So this is for UNHCR, but it's generic advice for any technical actor. First click. Second click. So the first thing which is critical is to do a feasibility analysis of inclusion, and to really work with a range of different actors to put a business case on the table that not only, let's say, not only signpost to the different, let's say, rights and other, let's say, legal instruments that governments may have signed up to, but actually give them the means to respect these types of agreements with concrete support and, of course, financing. Second one. So normally this first type of service is offered when the government's considering a type of program or a parent project that may be built upon. The second one is really to go through the project design informed by all the detailed protection analysis, and to really see how we need to adapt the design for additional dividends. And what's critical here is that we're advocating for additional dividends beyond the usual social protection dividends. And those are that we want to narrow the gap between de jure and de facto access to benefits and services, mitigate protection risks, have a real concrete way forward on towards a durable solution, and self-reliance and social cohesion dividends. If we're able to adapt a project to yield those dividends, we're trying to overall increase the impact of the project. We will also try to increase the absorbance capacity of government to take on international funding, particularly in remote areas where, let's say, many refugees are located. But also we want to also ensure that there's a timely disbursement of donor funds as well. And in a way, this is acting, I guess, as a risk guarantor. The third service that could be potentially critical is by offering support to data and analytics. This is leveraging different data that UNHCR, other humanitarian actors may have, other socioeconomic surveys, to save time in terms of the government understanding who is eligible for the social registry, but also who may be eligible also for targeting. This is not at the household level, this is just to understand global numbers for planning and budgeting processes. The fourth service is to really sit down and to understand how do we move from one delivery system to the next. So if you look at humanitarian or multi-purpose cash, it has its own delivery chain. At each stage, how do you go from one part of the chain to the next part of the chain? To have an overall plan that let's say, it enables the synergies between government, international actors, and different actors working across the nexus as well. And really to have a referral methodology. So when we're able to include a refugee, we know exactly how we're going to handle people at a case management level. The fifth service, which would be of great interest, is once we start implementing the program, it's clear that refugees who are unfamiliar with administrative systems, the language barriers, all sorts of access barriers that I think was mentioned before. We need to accompany refugees, but also we need to accompany social protection agencies. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide. And the last service, which is critical, and you can click, is we need to monitor not just the disbursement or the let's say, access to benefits, but the impact of inclusion. Because often in terms of social assistance or social safety nets, it's not meeting the complete needs of a household. There's a corporate risk for promoting inclusion if we're not ensuring that that duplication is not happening. But also this type of monitoring should really inform, let's say, the responsible withdrawal of humanitarian funds. In many situations with the World Bank projects that are starting to open up windows of inclusion, we've perhaps seen a very hasty retreat of humanitarian donors who are offering cash transfers, who don't understand completely that the impact of access to social assistance is in 3 years' time. It's not next year. So if we talk about, okay, what are some of the examples of, working around social protection delivery chain, we can go to the next slide. I'll go through these quite rapidly. If you can click on the first three. So, for example, in the assessment stage, there are key things that we can leverage, and this includes our whole registration refugee status determination, all of the civil documentation, access to civil documentation and digital IDs, and how we link this to the administrative eligibility and the documents required to be able to enroll on the social registry or open a bank account, all these critical things that are required. The other thing that we try to do with refugee populations is also for them to understand that their rights situation may have changed, that there is a new project opening up. We offer legal support, and we offer information on the social protection project that's coming online and how they can apply to it. Another critical thing that we do, which is the upstream part of developing the social registry and let's say targeting methodology, is to really, we're strongly advocating now for the inclusion of refugees in the poverty assessments. That's the sort of first phase of, let's say, national targeting. And we're also trying to work with different socioeconomic profiling exercises and targeting comparison exercises that basically try to basically understand that there are different types of socioeconomic profiles of refugees that may be eligible for the social registry, but also for different types of benefits, to try and understand that the numbers that we're dealing with. And the exercises that we're starting to do is to compare our, let's say, cash targeting with the targeting of the government, and to try and understand if we can have a type of proxy means test that enables us to harness our data sets to save time to understand who could be eligible, rather than having to do a socioeconomic survey at an early stage. If we go to the next step, and you can click down 3 ways, once we get to the enrollment stage, very early on, what we're trying to provide are risk registries. So what that means is we look at the whole project design. We take into account our experience with dealing with multi-purpose cash along the delivery chains and all the obstacles and hurdles, but also the where things have worked in dealing in a certain geographical area or dealing with certain agencies. And we try to unpack, and this is informed by the refugee policy review frameworks that we're starting to systematically do. We try to really unpack potentially if a government, if an inclusion window is opened up in the government system, what are the potential risks? What is the technical capacity we have to support? What are the feasibility and other risks that we need to mitigate? In terms of other aspects with data, we're also involved in the interoperability of data management systems, ensuring data privacy, but also trying to transfer data to the government, anonymized data that they can use for their modeling to determine globally who's eligible for social registries and for different targeting. The other thing we've got involved in also is to understand that many standard PMTs are not adapted to camp contexts. If many of the indicators are based on assets, we really try to look at consumption as well, and to try and work with the government to make it more applicable to the situation of refugees. If we go to the last 3 clicks on this slide, when we get to targeting, we're also promoting in some countries a mixed community-based targeting process. So if we get down to the last point where the community validates the targeting, we're trying to set up systems where that validation is done by mixed refugees and host communities, and that there's a very clear redress procedure that's publicly understood, where potentially discrimination can happen. A critical thing that I've talked about is that before refugees access benefits, early on in the process, that we've outlined a referral process to really understand that talks to our own teams, our own partners, but also to the government. Everyone's clear about that step by step what is the case management procedures for a refugee who's already enrolled on, let's say, UNHCR cash transfers, to then be enrolled onto a government system and to really deduplicate as much as possible and to really track that assistance as well. If we go to the next slide, once we get to, and you can click through here, you can click through most of the points. In fact, you can click through the whole slide because I'll go a bit quicker. In terms of once we're providing assistance, I think everything is underpinned, and we're seeing this play out in Ukraine as well, but other countries, that we need to translate everything, whether it's a digital platform, any type of advice, any type of material, awareness campaigns, outreach campaigns, everything has to be translated, and there has to be counselling services attached to that. So refugees really understand what they can and can't do and when they have to do things and what the requirements are. In terms of rolling out different activities, again, we're really trying to promote a range of these additional dividends. And so, for example, what we've found that we've had to do quite frequently is to those social protection agencies to help train on what international protection actually means, what the rights of refugees are, because at a local level, they may not be aware or they may not be respected. We're also doing training and incentives to set up mixed host and refugee user groups for income generating activities. We're also doing financial inclusion training, access to a range of different products for refugees. Again, all of these are ways that allow refugees that have certain access barriers, access to the different types of services and benefits. Very critical is to understand that refugees potentially have mobility rights and have different cultures that mean that it may be very difficult for women to move around or anyone to move around from a certain radius of the camp. So where you locate IGAs linked to or public works. Again, we want to inform also, we want to ensure that when we're including government systems that we're not derailing ongoing return programs. So we really inform our advice to governments as well by intention surveys and by modelling of movements to ensure that we're not increasing, let's say, pull factors. And lastly, and this is a key thing, is that we really are trying to continue to monitor the protection space to ensure that there is do no harm, and that let's say the program is not putting in place a new set of protection risks, that we've been involved in monitoring the reception of benefits and the respective conditionalities if it's linked to access to health or to education services, the cash transfer. And as I said before, it's important to understand the impact of inclusion, to understand about duplication, and to potentially have, let's say, data to inform very political decisions of retargeting assistance. So the last slide here, which I'll go ultra rapidly, is about adaptive social protection. The main challenge for us now is that most systems are set up for nationals and natural disasters, and persons of concern are excluded. And the emerging mechanisms where we've seen started to happen is that there are a whole set of COVID-19 measures that were channeled on top of the existing social assistance programs. We saw this in Cameroon, we saw this in the Republic of Congo. So the long-term inclusion agenda put in place a project that could channel additional shock responsive financing. Also at the household level, we run specific cash top-ups for specific protection incidents. So this is something that I think we focus on large-scale shocks in terms of adaptive social protection. We can also focus on household shocks. The World Bank has, I think, a flagship program in the Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Program, covering 6 countries. That is built on to additional social protection investments by the World Bank. It's been triggered for food security and COVID, and many of these World Bank projects have SEOC mechanisms, crisis modifiers, that allow them to redistribute funding according to a shock or other critical incidents. So I think I'll stop there, noting that I think the future for adaptive social protection for protected populations and other is about, let's say, accessing refugees to basically hazard-proof their livelihoods, and let's say to protect gains on self-reliance. And many of the livelihoods are climate sensitive, but also, which is quite critically, can be used as a contingency planning mechanism for future displacement in that peace vector. And this means merging a whole range of different early warning systems, but also setting up a larger standard operating procedures that could really trigger pre-negotiated humanitarian finance for displacement events. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for rushing at the end. Very much to the point, and I guess a good reminder of the complexity of the task and the reality check, maybe for those working on inclusive social protection systems. Thank you so much. So I will now invite Tanya Nino from WFP in Colombia, who will tell us about the program jointly implemented with the government of Colombia that aims to facilitate access to social protection to vulnerable displaced populations on the border with Venezuela. Over to you, Tanya.
Good morning, Awa. Thank you. Thanks again. Thank you to GIZ for the invitation. Let's get it started. I will appreciate, Karin, just go to the next, please. Thank you. So what I am prepared for these 15 minutes we have here is I want to share with you the Colombian experience of expansion of the social protection system to include Venezuelan migrants. And I have divided this presentation in 4 concrete and short components. The first one is key messages. The second is Colombian context. So you need to understand what is the situation in here. The third is the operation, and the fourth is some closing remarks. Next, please. Let's start with the key messages. I just want to mention the messages here, and throughout the presentation, I will give some inputs in order to understand which is these key takeaways that I want you to take after this presentation. So the first one, I repeat, I won't explain them. I'm just going to mention them, and at the end, I get back to these messages. The first one, the pandemic is bad for the people, but good for the system. The pandemic was bad for the people, but good for the system. The second message, one system for all. The third, it is expensive and needs a lot of political will at all levels. And the fourth message, it needs technical assistance, but it also needs operational support. It needs that the job gets done, and this is what we do in the WFP. So I'm just going to go now through several inputs and to explain what are we doing here jointly with the government, and then I get back to this. Perfect. Colombian context, you know, Colombia is located in South America. We have received right now over 2,300,000 Venezuelan migrants in the country. Next. And when we talk about social protection, it is so important to talk about poverty. And this is a graph, an official graph. I just want to explain to you what is the situation right now in Colombia after the pandemic. So you can see here you can see here in the 2021 year that we have a poverty level of 39.3 people under the poverty line. This means it's almost 20 million people, poor people that we have in Colombia last year. But if you get back to 2012, you can see that it's almost a huge setback for the country. We really got a setback of over 10 years in terms of poverty, in terms of the people that we achieved to take out of poverty, but dramatically after the pandemic, the result is so tragic. You can see here in absolute numbers, we have over 2 million people that we haven't been able to take out of the poverty to get back to the figures that we have in 2019. And this is for poverty. And if we go to the next, that is extreme poverty, the situation is even worse. And it is important to understand that for Colombia, extreme poverty is related with the amount of needed calorie requirement that a person needs just to survive. If you see here in this graph, in 2021, we have 12.2 people, 12.2 12.2% of people which are in under extreme poverty. We're talking about over 6 million people. And in 2019, we have 4,600,000. So if you can see here in the graph, if we go back to 2012, you will see that the situation after the pandemic is even worse than 10 years ago. Now in Colombia, we have more than 1,400,000 people, as you can see here in this last table at the end, that we haven't been able to take out of extreme poverty in order to get back to the situation that we have before the pandemic. So this is the poverty situation and its utmost expression, which is food insecurity. This is the Colombian context, taking into account the poverty situation. Go to the next slide, please. But if we talk about the social protection system, it is important to highlight, as Karin mentioned it before, that Colombia has the same component that the rest of the countries in the region and so many other countries in the planet. Social assistance and social security are part of the Colombian social protection system. Is a solid system. And in Colombia, in order to access the social programs, it is important to be registered in the official targeting mechanism that is called SISBEN. SISBEN is the official targeting mechanism that is a survey basically that help the government to classify household poverty level in extreme, moderate, and vulnerable. It is a complex operation because basically every poor person in Colombia or vulnerable needs to request this survey in the mayor's office, and then the mayor's office is going to put in place an operation to carry out a visit to the house of this person to check the socioeconomic conditions, the roof, the floor, the access to water, electricity, everything. This is SISBEN. It's a survey that is going to helps the government officially to measure poverty level. And the SISBEN is a door. It's a door to access the social protection system. It doesn't guarantee that the people is going to have access to all the social programs, but it is indispensable in order to access over 29 national social programs, including subsidized health, cash transfer, child care, and more others, and some others. So basically in Colombia, if you are poor, you need an ID that is for national, and now we have one for migrants, and you need SISBEN. So this is important to understand the next slide, that is about the national government strategy to integrate Venezuelan migrants in Colombia. That is a historical decision that has been welcomed for all of us in the international community. So the government of Colombia last year decided to implement a massive regularization program. This is very important because over more than 2 million people, Venezuelan migrants, is going to be benefited of this decision, and they can be protected over 10 years. And this permit that lasts 10 years is going to count for a residence permit. But the government said it's not enough. I just don't want to regularize the Venezuelan migrants. I also want to include them within the SISBEN, to register them within the SISBEN, so they can open this door to access the whole social protection system. And also it decided, and the quickest service that I have to put available for migrants is health, and even vaccination against COVID. So this is a strategic national strategy of the Colombian government to integrate the migrant population that is very, very important, interesting, and an example for the region. So from WFP, we quickly understood that the government needed support in putting this forward. So this responds to our corporate purpose that of strengthening the system. We need to strengthen the system, to expand the system, but also to make it better prepared for shocks, what just before was explained to us. And also because for us, it's very important that people depend less on the humanitarian assistance and is included in the social protection system. This is the best way to fight poverty, and of course, its expression that is food insecurity. This is very important for us. But if this decision is made at the national level, the government of Bogota decided to do this, we understood that the support needed to be at the local level. At the local level is where the CISBEN is carried out. The responsibility of operating the CISBEN is at the local level. In Bogota, the national government provides the general technical and technological support, but it's the responsibility of the mayor's office to put forward the operation. So we understood in WFP that sometimes, very often, the local authorities don't have enough capacity just to respond just to nationals. We have more poor nationals now, as you could see before, but also it will need support to receive the amount of migrants who are being regularized. So for this, we put forward a large operation. Just please go to the next. A large operation to help the government to integrate, to include the migrants in the system, to open the door, which is the CISBEN. So right now we have a large, complex operation of over 721 people simultaneously working in 37 cities and towns. We have acquired over 400 equipment, including computers, printers, routers, because they are necessary in order to do the operation. And of course, we have provided logistical support. Remember, it's a large operation, it's very complex. It's complex. I need to go to the house of the person to see which are its socioeconomic conditions. And this operation is going to scale. It's going to be scaled up until the end of the year, because we are hoping and we're working with the government, and we want to support its goal of reaching over 1 million migrants registered in the CISBEN. So we're hoping that this team is going to be scaled up to over 1,000 people working across the country. So this is the operation. This is what the government and Colombian have decided to do in order to include the Venezuelan migrants in the country. So now again, I want to get back to the beginning. Just go to the next slide. And with this, I'm going to close this presentation. I just want to expand on these key messages that I started with at the beginning. So the first message, the pandemic was bad for the people, but good for the system. There is no doubt. You could see, we all know that the pandemic just increased the poverty level, as I just showed you before. But it was good for the system because it was the only opportunity to adapt, to make it flexible, to adjust, to respond to a crisis. It was the opportunity to do it. And it has three important elements and I want to highlight today. The first one, the change that the system had is irreversible. That is very important. The system right now, the social protection system in Colombia, and I know in other parts of the region, is not the same as before, and is not going to get back to as it was before. The change is irreversible. The system adapted in a very key part, that is the information system. This is the key part of the adaptation of the social protection system. In Colombia, with the pandemic, the government decided to use CISBEN as an important part, and it cross-checked the CISBEN with all the databases that it has available in order to target people, to reach out to people who were in need and who weren't receiving any assistance, because the need, remember the pandemic, the need was great. People needed assistance immediately. And the government used the information system, used the latest version of CISBEN and other databases in order to target people. And in this process, this is a new way that now is being used and is going to continue to be used in order to reach out to people. The government set an important, key cash transfer program called Ingreso Solidario in order to reach people who were receiving assistance. And this change was good for migrants because it was the opportunity to open up the system for migrants. It's the only cash transfer program still ongoing that is going to continue still for a long time that is open for migrants. So the system, the pandemic was good for the system because it made good changes that make the system more flexible, because it was an opportunity to open up for the migrant population. The second message is one system for all, and this is very important, and we have to help the government to make this. It's because we have to get one vision of development, one vision about poverty. We cannot have a system, a social protection system for Colombian and a chapter for migrants. We need to have one whole vision, and this is where we're trying to help the government, and I think the government is having this perspective. The third message, it is expensive and it's a lot of political will. You can imagine how to put forward a massive regularization needs a lot of a firm decision, and also to open up the system with, for example, the registration in Seyfert, but it is expensive. This Seyfert now opens the door to access all social programs, but these social programs need economic strength, economic muscle, because of course it's so expensive. We have more poor people in Colombia, and it needs more support and funding, and the debt, you know, already for these countries is very high. And finally, I finish with this, Maren, is the fourth message, is about what the state needs. And I think this is very important, and this is the key part, is a key component for WFP. The situation doesn't only need technical assistance, it needs that. We provide this, we advise the government. But really what Colombian state needs is operational support. As international community, we need to roll up our sleeve and get the job done and do the job. Not where we think that is needed, not what has been done in other countries, but where the government, where the country needed. And in this case is what we have been doing in Colombia. We have supported in a specific critical part the integration of the migrant population, and we are very proud to be at this point the arm of the state to register in Seyfert the migrants, the Venezuelan migrants in the country. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to the Colombian government for its opening and because it trusts the worker program to do all this huge work. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Very interesting case, an example of government ambitions to include non-nationals and also maybe for the interface that Karin was mentioning in her presentation between international actors and national governments. So very interesting. Thank you so much, everyone. If the speakers could turn on their cameras, we will start the Q&A session. There's a couple of questions that have been put in the Q&A box. Some of them have been answered actually directly by the speakers. However, for the sake of the audience, and I'm sure not everyone had the chance to read them, I would ask maybe to go through the answers again. Karin, the first one I would address to you. It's an addition to the framing concept that you provided in the beginning. And the question is on returnees. It was remarked that you haven't mentioned returnees in your presentation, and the question was whether this is because they qualify as internally displaced populations, but also what specific barriers to access to social protection do they face? And I guess you have maybe touched on it in the portability aspect, but there's surely much more to it. So over to Karin.
Thanks, Maren. And yeah, thanks, Marco. Like, a really good question. And so returnees, I mean, assuming this is voluntary return, goes without saying, they're not, we wouldn't say that they're forcibly displaced. From a systems perspective, they would be considered as just ordinary citizens, as in anybody else making a claim or an application. And there, I think we just have what you would almost call standard inclusion issues that you have whenever you have a social protection program. And marginalized or invisible populations always tend to be excluded anyway, because they don't have the right documentation, as this returnee likely probably wouldn't have the right documentation. They're not familiar with the system. They don't know how it works. They don't know how to apply. So all these access issues, I think, are unfortunately pretty standard across social protection programs, and they're not just specific to the forcibly displaced, and this returnee would face them as well. A particular one that Maren also touched on is portability, but that's not really related to the new national system that this person comes to. But ideally, they would also like to make a claim against payments they've made in the system elsewhere and have that to be portable. And for that, you would need agreements across countries for portability of social protection, so that you know, I don't know, maybe it's a Thai person who worked in the Middle East and they paid into a social protection system in the Middle East and they could get the benefits at old age in Thailand, right? That would be ideal, but would require agreements between Thailand and, say, a Gulf country. But yeah, returnees would not be classified under forcibly displaced, but they would certainly face also issues of exclusion, but they are the ones that are faced by people who are excluded for reasons of ethnicity, identity, language, marginalization, so other more standard issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. Maybe we add one question that came up for Tanya's presentation, actually, which is more for clarification before we deep dive into the more complex issues. So Tanya, there's a question on how CISBEN will be updated as the situation of some vulnerable people will have to improve or change over time. And also the other question related to your presentation was how the financial need to accommodate the additional people into social protection systems was provided for.
The CISBEN, the people need to update the information. It's something that every family has to do. They have to go there if they change the contact details, or if there is a member of the family who passes away, a new member, they have to update the information. And more or less over it, every 7 to 10 years, the whole system gets some general new version, because we need to emerge. Basically, is this. And the second point, the funding is the biggest problem right now in the country, especially after the pandemic, as I said before, because it's a huge debt that Colombia has right now. So the situation is critical, and yeah, there is not enough to reach out to all the people, Colombians and migrants. So the government is doing a huge effort just to use specifically a better targeting process in order to reach out to those who are who need the most. Over.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Then another question that was posted quite at the beginning and is touching, I guess, on a big elephant in the room is on competing priorities. The question was focused on Pakistan and reads, how can a country like Pakistan do something regarding social protection of Afghan refugees in that case, living there since 2 decades, when we're unable to properly extend that social protection to our own deserving ones. So Karin, maybe you want to start with answering. I'm sure Andrew and Tanya have something to add there.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think this is a perennial problem about, and this goes to the whole question of burden sharing, right? That just because you have the luck, if you want to say, to be a neighboring country to a conflict, that often means you have a very high proportion of refugees compared to what other countries are hosting. And often in countries where you don't have a developed social protection system yourself. So my hunch is, or I would say that the World Bank IDA 18 window is a way towards this. So I think there's more of a recognition that the international community needs to start co-funding, right? So through, I mean, from my perspective, ideally budget support, but also supporting UN agencies, so that the funding would come internationally, while the beneficial, I mean, the systems ideally would be national, so supporting national systems. This is, for instance, what's happening in the European Union in Greece, where EU budget support is going to Greece to support refugees there, because Greece has a comparatively high burden. I mean, realistically speaking, especially so in the Pakistani context, it'll be very difficult to get the international community to, to pay the required sums, even though, I mean, personally, I think they should. But, or for instance, if you look at the Turkish case where, the European Union again has been funding a lot of the cash transfer program that's been sort of delivered there. But also every year or every time the program gets renewed, there's discussions about, oh, you know, the funding should be cut, and oh, shouldn't this be funded by Turkey from tax revenue? And I think that's not entirely fair and not quite disingenuous. I mean, a bit disingenuous from, like, I think OECD countries to expect poor countries to like carry the whole burden themselves financially. But, you know, this is like, yeah, this goes to the whole question of burden sharing, and I don't think it's been resolved fairly at the moment.
I'd like to come in on Pakistan because it's been on our radar for some time. We've been tracking the IDA 18, the IDA 19 process that the government has been involved in terms of negotiations. So I think a couple of points on Pakistan. The Afghan, in a way, the Afghan situation is clearer now in some ways. It's very difficult, and it will be for the long term, to motivate large-scale returns. So there's a political reality that there will be, you know, refugees on Pakistani soil for some time. We are looking with ILO. There seems to be a foothold to potentially look at a health insurance program. So we're starting to look at the feasibility of that. But I would come back to, you know, when we were listening to the World Bank Spring Series, and we had different representatives from the Pakistan government, and that was showcased as a global good example of rapidly scaling up the social assistance programs backed by international financing. So in terms of capacity, in terms of funding, I'm not sure that's the main problem. I think the main problem is political. So for the IDA 18 and IDA 19 process, for example, there is finance available to basically open up windows of inclusion where 80-90% of the investments go to host communities, and maybe, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30% go to refugees. And the conditionality is it has to be in the refugee hosting area. So the finance is there. The political decision is, let's say, how the loan is blended and whether the government wants full grants and doesn't want to take any type of loan for non-nationals. So that's a political issue there. The other thing which I would point out is that I think the opportunities for the Pakistani government is to look at refugees as a source of economic revenue. You know, so if the rights landscape is opened up, and this is my first slide, it said that any inclusion has to be underpinned by stable income opportunities, and ideally for refugees to become economic agents, they have to contribute. And so other countries have been successful in doing that. And I would agree with Karin. I think it's not realistic for the international community to assume that the refugees will be absorbed in the domestic fiscal space. For me, that's not a short-term realistic or even medium-term realistic option. And also, I think the last thing I would say is that when we're talking about inclusion, I don't think we should put forever on the table when we're not talking about a durable solution yet. So we're not talking about local integration or getting naturalization. We're talking about time-bound inclusion, and this would be the message for the Syria situation as well, 10 years down the track, you know, time-bound inclusion, refugees paying, not forever, and it shouldn't be seen as such. And the last thing I'll say is that we do not want to, in Pakistan or anywhere else, just shift the humanitarian burden onto the social safety net with no prospect of graduation out to refugees actually contributing. And so this was, let's say, a lesson learned, maybe not at the beginning for the ESSN in Turkey, but we have to be thinking about graduating people to be economic agents as soon as you're getting into the social assistance, because we can't expect a sort of dead end for all refugees never to contribute to social protection systems. So more than happy to pick up the discussion with our Pakistan team and the government at any stage.
Tanya, is there anything you want to add on this question? Okay. So the next maybe cluster of questions, there's a couple of questions that touch on the interface between humanitarian assistance and social protection with different dimensions. So there's one question on whether forcibly displaced populations could be integrated in the design of social protection systems or programs, for example, at the assessment phase. And another question is directed at Tanya, but also is something that is discussed a lot in the community, I guess, is whether the entitlements that social protection programs usually provide are actually enough to cover the needs for displaced populations, which are often much higher than the ones of national populations. And then a third question related to this nexus is about whether you have any experience on refugees or forcibly displaced populations who would not want to be integrated into national social protection systems, given exactly what we touched upon before, that the humanitarian system is sometimes providing more or more adequate assistance than the national systems. So, Tanya, maybe can you start with your perspective from WFP and then over to Andrew, who definitely has something to add.
Yeah, of course. So the first question is, the system is already being implemented. The social protection system has been already designed. What we see now is an adaptation, irreversible, with open to migrants, but it's hard to see if they can be some kind of participation by the migrant population. There is still a lot of room to include the migration with the migrants within the system. So I don't see it possible at this point. Regarding the assistance that is provided to the migrants, is not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough either for Colombians. What the government does, especially with transfers, is to complement the income of the Colombian and the migrants' families, but it's not enough to cover basic needs. It's so much need, and the resources has to be targeted, specifically targeted, and it's not only enough to cover everything. And there are cases, indeed, in where the migrants don't want to be registered, for example, in Spain, and do not access the regularization process, and it has so many causes. We don't have many. I don't have all of them, but one of them is self-exclusion, for example, that they don't know, they don't understand. There is a lot of confusion, and there is one that for me and for the work that we have done here in WFP in Colombia is very important, and is that we need the migrants to establish a new relation with the state that is different, and the relation they had in Venezuela. It's another country, it's another state, it's another way to do things. In Colombia is different, and to get the migrants to understand this is a challenge, and we need to keep working on that. Over.
Andrew, you have something to add? Sure.
I can tie all those three things together, hopefully. So I think that the starting point is that many of the social assistance transfer values, at least in the World Bank African, so there are 13 projects now in Africa, and then one in Bangladesh on social protection, the bank projects. They don't cover, if you look at the minimum expenditure basket or any other measures of basic needs, I think this is what Tanya is saying, they don't cover refugees or host population needs. So that's the first thing to understand. And in that side, the refugees have the chance to have an international community, in many cases, supporting them over host communities, which is a major problem that we always try to mitigate. The other thing is some of these World Bank investments are allowing the government to actually scale up the transfer value. So, for example, in Mauritania, it's leading to a tripling of the cash transfer benefit. So again, it's trying to. This is where development investments have a real role to fill the gap between what the transfer value is and filling whatever basic need value. And I think the other thing to understand is that I think particularly in nascent systems, there's a parity gap. If you add up all the assistance a refugee family gets compared to the same socioeconomic profile of a host family, there's a gap, and often the refugee family gets more than the host community. So that gap is critical, and part of monitoring the impact of inclusion. And it's again a political decision to take families of humanitarian assistance, refugee families, onto the government system where they have full rights and full access, that there's this gap which is called the parity gap. There are different ways to fill it, and there are a whole range of political decisions, but I come back to my point that we need to monitor the impacts of inclusion to navigate that very difficult territory. In terms of the disincentives for integration into social protection systems, as Tanya has pointed out, if you get more from the humanitarian system versus the government system, it's a disincentive. If you're holding out for resettlement, so this is what we saw in some of the Somaliland, Ethiopian camps, people weren't registering because they thought they might be jeopardizing, you know, a ticket to the States. IDPs, where there are winners and losers of conflicts. So we're seeing IDPs, there's a set of IDPs in Iraq who are affiliated, who are perceived as being affiliated with ISIS. They don't want to be identified. So some of the winners and losers out of an internal conflict, they, for protection reasons, don't want to be identified. So and there's another set of displaced populations that are in the informal economy, and both them and, let's say, the employees, it's a difficult relationship. They don't want formalization of that market. So again, I'm thinking of the border with Somalia and Ethiopia about trying to incentivize refugees into business and IJ opportunities that are formalized. A lot of disincentives for doing that. And I think the last thing I'd say, and it comes back to the triangle, I said that we need to inform inclusion by working on the links between regularizing informal labor markets, trying to graduate them to formal labor markets, but then trying to link both to formal social protection benefits. And this comes, I think, Jean-Louis, this is part of his question, is that there are a range of informal mechanisms or intermediaries like cooperatives, CSO or others that can play that critical gap between informality and formal social protection benefits. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm really sorry, there's so many more interesting questions in the Q&A box. Someone, one specifically on social cohesion and labor markets, coming from Turkey, which I find it very interesting, but we need to slowly wrap up. There was also two questions that are more general and that lead to very well into the closing remarks that we had prepared for. So one question was on referring to the barriers that Karin was presenting in the beginning, mentioning that we have heard a lot about barriers, but now how to best overcome those. It was touched upon obviously in the discussion already, but wrapping this up would be helpful. And another question was asking for any most important recommendations. What can we do better, basically, to include and integrate forcibly displaced populations into national social protection systems? So to wrap up the debate, I would like to give each speaker a little minute to reflect on the discussion and share with us his or her key takeaways from this discussion, but also the maybe 3 critical steps towards inclusive social protection systems by 2030. Karin, would you be willing to start and then hand over to Tanya and then to Andrew? Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Maren. So I think in terms of like the question barriers and how can we overcome them, and I think that links, as you say, Maren, a little bit into sort of next steps or actions. So I mean, coming from a social protection background, one of my, I don't know, favorite or preferred things is just to reconsider system strengthening. And I think in all the debate on sort of including new populations or making social protection systems shock responsive or adaptive, we sometimes forget about just the nuts and bolts about system strengthening. And I think both Andrew and Tanya talked about having technical systems components in the delivery of their programs. And I think that's really important to make sure that whatever system they are strengthened. And I think that sort of that shows that once you have a strong system, then you can deliver at scale. And I know it's from a sort of OECD country background, but I just want to bring in the example of sort of Germany. And in the 1990s, sort of Germany sort of integrated the East German labor market into their labor force, which led to massive upskilling of job centers, which then has been used in integrating sort of Syrian refugees into labor markets and now Ukraine refugees. So what I want to say, it's the long game, but in a much lower level, of course, but investing in systems strengthening, just your standard systems strengthening will then also help in crisis. The second thing is then, just because it's forced displacement doesn't mean the system doesn't have other forms of exclusion issues. So I think a lot of reasons why forcibly displaced people are excluded, at least at the registration and operational level, are reasons why marginalized people are excluded in general. So again, I think if we work on including and designing systems that are inclusive, that are participatory, then I think that will also help in crisis and in integrating populations that aren't sort of the standard beneficiaries. So I know Maren, you asked for three, but I think I'll leave it at the two, which are system strengthening and also inclusion helps across the board, even if it's not just the forcibly displaced. And am I handing over to Tanya or to Andrew? I forgot.
To Tanya, thank you.
To Tanya.
Thank you. No, I totally agree with Karin about the need of strengthening the system, because it's good for the system itself, and it runs better, but also to respond to shocks. But I just to add one thing to that is that opening the system or adapting the system to receive displaced population is hard. It's complicated. I think the Colombian government has set the frame in order to do it. It has made like big structural changes, as I mentioned it before, especially with the information system. But to do it, to get it done really, like to really include the people, it needs a lot of logistic and operational support. And I think the need is there. I am convinced that we need to keep supporting this specifically concrete action. We need to help the government to do the job. And this part, it's also expensive and it's also costly. So I think there is room for the international community to really help to, at the operational level, specifically supporting local authorities that maybe are the weakest of the whole system, to include the migrant population. That's it. Over.
So I'll go very rapidly. So the first critical thing is that we systematically do feasibility analyses and economic modelling to provide a proper business case to governments to allow them pragmatically to live up to a range of different, rights-based agreements that they signed in for social protection, for refugees, for whatever. Give them the chance, backed by proper modelling, to understand the montage of investments they require and how they can enlarge the right space, and to really try and harness forcibly displaced populations as economic agents contributing to the system. Critically underpinning this is a systematic area-based approach that strengthens the system, that scales up coverage for all in the hosting areas, and link this to the universal social protection agenda, which, because in the MDGs it was non-nationals and the ultra poor that were excluded, and because the SDGs are not disaggregated, there are risks. The second thing is that we need to have predictable international investments as close as possible to the source of displacement or along the displacement pathways. And I just want to understate this. An OECD study has just come out saying that 71% of ODA investments for refugees come from short-term humanitarian mechanisms, when we already know that more than 3/4 of refugees are in protracted situations, with those humanitarian investments were never designed to meet those protracted needs. The third thing I would say is that we need to enlarge the risk landscape for shock responsive and adaptive social protection programs to cover conflict, to cover mass displacement, merging a whole series of early warning systems and standard operating procedures, really having a clear link between the social protection and the disaster risk management agencies in those countries. And lastly, we need to monitor the impacts of inclusion and disaggregate global monitoring systems such as the World Bank's Aspire, such as the ILO SDG monitoring, because we need to really understand what is the impact of that inclusion so that humanitarian donors can withdraw their, let's say, investments responsibly, so that international agencies can understand how to complement gaps that the social protection system is not going to offer, and where we can really make sure that there's no duplication of precious resources. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to the three of you. So such a helpful leadway and ending of the discussion, I guess. So closing the webinar, I would like to thank again, Karin, Tanya, and Andrew, for your very interesting and stimulating contributions to our participants. Thank you for the attention and for the very interesting questions. Apology for not being able to answer all of them. Thank you for joining this session. Please take a moment to answer the survey that will appear on your browser after we close, and stay tuned for the next session of the Aspects Practice Exchange on Adaptive Social Protection webinar series. Special thanks as well to socialprotection.org team in Brazil for making this happen. And please participate as well in the short survey that follows this webinar. Good end of the day, and we will look forward to seeing you soon again.